morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Officer Johnson took his position. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, every button polished to shine like mirrors. The tall black hat sat firmly on his head, and his rifle rested against his shoulder in the exact position he had practiced thousands of times. Johnson had been doing this job for 3 years now. Every single day he stood perfectly still for hours, watching the world go by while tourists snapped photos and tried their best to make him smile, laugh, or even blink. Children would make funny faces at him. Adults would tell jokes right in front of his face. Some people even tried to touch him or his uniform, but Johnson never moved. Not even a little bit. This was what being a Queen's Guard meant. You were like a living statue, protecting one of the most important places in the world. It was an honor that few people could handle, and Johnson was proud of every single day he spent in that red uniform. The training had been intense. Months of learning to stand completely still, no matter what happened around him. They taught him to ignore everything. Loud noises, bad weather, people trying to distract him. His instructors had thrown everything at him during practice. Fake emergencies, people pretending to faint, even staged arguments right in front of him. Nothing was supposed to make a Queen's Guard break character. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, the air was crisp and cool. London was waking up slowly, and the first groups of tourists were already gathering near the palace gates. Johnson could hear their excited chatter in different languages. Some were taking selfies, others were reading guidebooks about the history of the guards. Johnson loved these quiet moments before the crowds got bigger. He could watch the city come alive while staying perfectly still. Pigeons walked around his feet, completely unbothered by his presence. They had learned that this red-coated human never moved, so they treated him like part of the landscape. His fellow guards were at their positions too. They had all started their shifts at the same time, walking out in perfect formation. Each man knew exactly where to stand and how to hold himself. They were like pieces of a well-oiled machine, each one playing his part in protecting the royal family and maintaining centuries of tradition. The tourists loved taking pictures with them. Johnson had probably been in thousands of photos by now, sent all over the world to family and friends. People would show their vacation pictures and point him out. Look, this is one of the Queen's Guards. He wondered sometimes if any of those people knew his name or thought about the real person inside the uniform. But that was the job. You became part of something bigger than yourself. You represented history, tradition, and the unwavering strength of the British monarchy. Every guard before him had stood in similar positions, faced similar challenges, and maintained the same perfect discipline that made the Queen's Guard legendary around the world. Johnson's family was proud of him. His mother kept newspaper clippings about the Queen's Guard in a scrapbook. His father, who had served in the military himself, understood the dedication it took to stand motionless for hours while staying alert and ready for anything. The morning routine was always the same. Check the uniform twice. Make sure every piece of equipment was in perfect condition. Walk to the position with military precision. Take the stance and begin the long watch. Hour after hour, staying focused and professional while the world moved around him. Today felt like any other day. The weather was pleasant, not too hot or cold. The crowd was friendly and respectful. Johnson settled into his familiar rhythm of watchful stillness, his eyes scanning the area while his body remained perfectly motionless. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, everything he had trained for would be put to the ultimate test. This ordinary Tuesday morning would become the day that would change his life forever and show the world what it truly meant to be a Queen's Guard. The clock tower chimed in the distance, marking another hour in Johnson's long career of silent service. He stood tall and proud, ready for whatever the day might bring, completely unaware that he was about to face a situation that no training manual had ever prepared him for. As the morning progressed, more and more visitors gathered around the palace. Tour groups arrived in colorful buses. Families with excited children pointed at the guards, and couples posed for romantic photos with the famous red uniforms in the background. Johnson had seen it all before, but he never got tired of watching people's faces light up when they saw the Queen's Guard for the first time. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled for 11 a.m., and the crowd was already building in anticipation. This was always the busiest time of Johnson's day. Hundreds of people would gather to watch the precise military movements as fresh guards replaced those who had been on duty. Johnson noticed all kinds of people in the crowd today. There were elderly couples with cameras hanging around their necks, taking their time to capture every detail. Young backpackers were checking things off their London bucket lists. School children on field trips were learning about British history and traditions. Among all these typical tourists, one man caught Johnson's attention. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, probably in his 30s, with short black hair. Nothing about him seemed particularly unusual at first glance, but something in his behavior made Johnson take a mental note. The man kept looking around nervously, checking his phone and fidgeting with something in his jacket pocket. Johnson had been trained to notice these little details. Part of being a good guard wasn't just standing still, it was staying alert to anything that might be out of place or potentially dangerous. Most of the time, nervous behavior just meant someone was lost, late for a meeting, or worried about their travel plans. But guards were taught to pay attention anyway. The nervous man walked closer to the palace gates, then back toward the crowd, then closer again. He seemed unsure of what he wanted to do or where he wanted to go. Johnson watched him carefully while maintaining his perfectly still posture. His eyes tracked the man's movements without his head moving even slightly. At exactly 11 a.m., the ceremony began. The new guards marched out in perfect formation, their boots clicking against the stone in perfect rhythm. The crowd pressed closer to get better views and photos. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Everyone was focused on the colorful display of British pageantry. Johnson participated in the ceremony with military precision. Every movement was calculated and practiced. Every step was exactly the right length. Every turn was perfectly timed with his fellow guards. This was the part of the job that reminded him why he loved being a Queen's Guard. The ceremony connected him to hundreds of years of tradition and made him part of something truly special. The nervous man in the dark jacket was still there, but now he had moved to a different spot. Johnson noticed that instead of watching the ceremony like everyone else, the man kept looking directly at him. Their eyes met briefly, and Johnson saw something troubling in the stranger's expression. It wasn't the usual curiosity or excitement that most visitors showed. This was something else entirely. After the ceremony ended, most of the crowd began to scatter. Some people lingered to take more photos, but the big group started breaking up into smaller clusters. Tour guides led their groups toward the next stop on their itineraries. Families consulted their maps to decide where to go next, but the man in the dark jacket didn't leave. Instead, he stayed right where he was, still staring at Johnson with that same intense expression. Johnson's training kicked in. He had been taught to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him that something wasn't right about this situation. The man started walking directly toward Johnson's position. This wasn't unusual by itself. Lots of tourists came close to take photos or get a better look at the uniform and equipment. But this man's approach felt different. His steps were deliberate and focused. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. His face showed a mixture of anger and determination that Johnson had never seen before in all his years of service. Johnson remained perfectly still, as always, but internally he was preparing himself for whatever might happen next. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure and assess threats quickly. Whatever this man wanted, Johnson would handle it with the same professionalism and discipline that had made him an excellent Queen's Guard. The distance between them was getting smaller. 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. The man's pace never slowed down, and his stare never wavered from Johnson's face. In just a few more seconds, he would be close enough to reach out and touch Johnson's uniform. Johnson had no idea that he was about to face the most challenging moment of his entire career. The man stopped directly in front of Johnson, close enough that Johnson could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Johnson maintained his trained expression of complete neutrality, while the stranger's face showed signs of obvious distress and confusion. "You need to help me," the man said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. "They're watching me. They're everywhere." Johnson had heard strange comments before. Sometimes tourists said odd things to try to get a reaction from the guards. Other times, people with mental health issues approached them believing the guards could solve their problems. Johnson remained perfectly still, his eyes looking straight ahead as if the man wasn't even there. The stranger became more agitated when Johnson didn't respond. He began looking over his shoulder repeatedly, scanning the crowd of remaining tourists and locals walking by. His breathing became faster and more shallow. Whatever was going through his mind was clearly causing him significant anxiety and fear. "I know you can hear me," the man said, stepping even closer. "I need you to listen to me. This is important. They've been following me for days. I don't know who else to trust." Still, Johnson gave no indication that he heard anything. This was exactly what his training had prepared him for. No matter what anyone said or did, a Queen's Guard never broke character. He was representing centuries of tradition and the dignity of the royal family. Personal feelings and reactions had no place in this job, but then something changed in the stranger's expression. The nervousness and fear transformed into something much more dangerous: anger and desperation. His right hand moved slowly toward the inside of his dark jacket. Johnson's peripheral vision caught the movement, but he couldn't turn his head to get a better look without breaking protocol. The man's hand disappeared inside his jacket, and when it emerged a few seconds later, everything changed in an instant. Johnson found himself staring down the barrel of what appeared to be a black handgun, pointed directly at his chest from less than 3 feet away. "Don't move or I'll shoot," the man shouted, loud enough for everyone within 50 yards to hear clearly. The effect on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. People who had been calmly taking photos and chatting with friends suddenly screamed and scattered in every direction. A mother grabbed her young daughter and ran toward the street. An elderly man dropped his camera and stumbled backward. Tourists who had been peacefully enjoying their London vacation found themselves in the middle of what looked like a life-or-death situation. But Johnson did something that would later be replayed on news, broadcasts around the world, and analyzed by security experts for years to come. He did absolutely nothing. His posture remained perfectly erect. His facial expression didn't change by even the slightest degree. His breathing stayed steady and controlled. His eyes continued to stare straight ahead, looking right through the armed man as if he were completely invisible. The gunman's hand was shaking now, making the weapon waver slightly as he struggled to keep it pointed at Johnson's chest. "I said don't move. Do you understand me? I will pull this trigger right now." For Johnson, time seemed to slow down. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He was acutely aware of every detail around him: the sound of panicked footsteps running away, the smell of car exhaust from the nearby street, the feeling of his uniform against his skin. But his training took over completely. Years of discipline and preparation guided his response, or rather, his complete lack of response. This was the moment that would define not just Johnson's career, but his entire life. Everything he had learned about duty, courage, and self-control was being tested in the most extreme way possible. A weapon was pointed at his heart, and one wrong move could end everything. But Johnson understood something that most people never have to learn. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all. The standoff had begun, and neither man knew how it would end. Seconds felt like hours as the two men faced each other in this deadly confrontation. The area around them had cleared completely. Tourists and locals had either run for safety or hidden behind nearby barriers and buildings. The only sounds were distant traffic and the heavy breathing of the armed man standing just feet away from Johnson. The stranger's weapon continued to shake in his unsteady hands. Sweat was now running down his face, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. He kept looking around frantically, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows at any moment. "Why won't you talk to me?" he demanded, his voice becoming more desperate. "I know you're real. I know you can hear me. Just tell me what I should do." Johnson's remarkable composure was being tested beyond anything he had ever imagined during his training. His instructors had prepared him for many scenarios, but none of them had involved having a weapon pointed directly at his chest by someone who seemed to be losing touch with reality. Every instinct Johnson possessed was screaming at him to move, to defend himself, to call for help. But his discipline ran deeper than instinct. He had made a commitment when he put on this uniform, and that commitment meant something more important than his own personal safety. He represented something bigger than himself, the unwavering strength and dignity of the institution he served. Meanwhile, across the palace grounds, security cameras had already captured what was happening. Alert systems had been triggered and armed police units were being dispatched to the scene. But they were still several minutes away, and those minutes might as well have been hours in this tense situation. The gunman was becoming increasingly agitated by Johnson's complete lack of response. He had expected fear, pleading, or at least some kind of acknowledgement. Instead, he was facing someone who seemed completely unaffected by the threat of immediate violence. This was not how he had imagined this confrontation would go. "Answer me," he shouted, taking another step closer. Now the weapon was less than 2 feet from Johnson's chest. "I need help." "Can't you see that I need help?" "Why is everyone ignoring me?" For the first time since this ordeal began, Johnson felt a flicker of something other than trained discipline. There was genuine pain in the stranger's voice, a deep anguish that went beyond simple criminal intent. This wasn't someone who wanted to hurt people for money or revenge. This was someone who was suffering and didn't know how to make it stop. But Johnson's training held firm. Regardless of the gunman's motivations or mental state, Johnson's job was to remain steady and professional. He couldn't solve this man's problems by breaking protocol, and any sudden movement might escalate the situation into actual violence. The stranger began pacing back and forth in front of Johnson, never lowering the weapon but clearly struggling with what to do next. His initial plan, whatever it had been, wasn't working the way he had expected. Johnson's complete lack of reaction was forcing him to confront the reality that threatening violence wouldn't solve whatever problems he was facing. "They told me you would help," the man said, his voice becoming quieter and more confused. "They said the guards would know what to do." "But you won't even look at me. You won't even admit that I exist." Johnson began to understand that this confrontation wasn't really about him at all. The stranger was dealing with something much deeper and more complex than a simple criminal act. He was someone who felt invisible and ignored by the world, and he had chosen the most dramatic way possible to force someone to pay attention to him. In the distance, Johnson could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching. Help was on the way, but he had no idea how much longer this standoff would continue or how the armed man would react when he realized that police were coming. The weapon remained pointed directly at Johnson's heart, and the stranger's finger was still on the trigger. One wrong move, one moment of panic, and this entire situation could end in tragedy. All Johnson could do was continue to embody the values he had sworn to uphold: courage, discipline, and unshakable commitment to duty, no matter what the personal cost might be. The sirens were getting closer now, and the gunman could hear them too. His head snapped toward the sound, and his already panicked expression became even more frantic. He realized that his time was running out, but he still didn't seem to know what he actually wanted to accomplish. No, he muttered, turning back to face Johnson. "This isn't how it's supposed to happen. You're supposed to help me before they get here." Johnson could see that the situation was reaching a critical point. The stranger was becoming more desperate as he realized that police were approaching. These were often the most dangerous moments in any confrontation, when someone felt trapped and out of options. The man raised the weapon higher, pointing it directly at Johnson's face now, instead of his chest. "Look at me," he screamed. "Just look at me. I'm a person. I exist. I matter." But Johnson continued to stare straight ahead with the same unwavering composure he had maintained throughout this entire ordeal. His face showed no fear, no anger, no judgment, just the calm professionalism that had made him one of the most respected guards in his unit. Then something completely unexpected happened. The stranger's angry shouting suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his whole body began to shake violently. The weapon fell from his trembling hands and clattered across the stone ground as he collapsed in what was clearly some kind of medical emergency. For the first time, in his 3-year career as a Queen's Guard, Johnson broke protocol. Without hesitation, he immediately dropped to his knees beside the fallen man, abandoning his post and his rigid posture to help someone who desperately needed assistance. "Medical emergency," Johnson called out loudly, his voice carrying across the palace grounds. "I need medical assistance here right now." The man on the ground was having what appeared to be a severe seizure. His arms and legs were moving uncontrollably, and he was making choking sounds as his body convulsed. Johnson had basic first aid training from his military service, and he knew that the most important thing was to keep the man safe and clear his airway. Johnson carefully turned the stranger onto his side to prevent him from choking, and made sure there was nothing nearby that he could hurt himself on during the seizure. He spoke in calm, reassuring tones, even though the man probably couldn't hear him. "It's okay, sir. Help is coming. You're going to be all right." The weapon that had been pointed at Johnson's chest just moments earlier was revealed to be a realistic-looking toy gun, the kind that children played with but detailed enough to fool anyone from a distance. Johnson realized that this entire terrifying confrontation had been the result of a medical condition, not criminal intent. Armed police officers arrived on the scene just as the seizure was beginning to subside. They quickly assessed the situation, saw Johnson providing medical care to the collapsed man, and immediately called for an ambulance instead of treating this as a criminal incident. "He's having a medical emergency," Johnson explained to the officers while continuing to monitor the stranger's condition. "The weapon isn't real. I think he's been confused and scared, not trying to hurt anyone." Paramedics arrived within minutes and took over the man's care. As they worked to stabilize him and prepare him for transport to the hospital, Johnson learned more about what had really happened during those terrifying few minutes. The stranger's name was David Chen, and he was a 34-year-old tourist visiting from Canada. According to his medical identification bracelet, which the paramedics found, he suffered from a rare form of epilepsy that could cause severe confusion, hallucinations, and aggressive behavior before seizures occurred. David had been experiencing symptoms for several days while traveling alone in London. The unfamiliar environment, jet lag, and stress had likely triggered his condition. In his confused state, he had genuinely believed that people were following him and that he was in danger. The toy gun had been a souvenir he purchased for his young nephew back home. As the ambulance prepared to leave, David briefly regained consciousness. When he saw Johnson's concerned face looking down at him, his first words were an apology. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I don't know what happened. Did I hurt anyone?" Johnson's response would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it that day. Johnson looked down at David with genuine warmth in his eyes, the same eyes that had stared straight ahead with perfect discipline just minutes earlier. "You didn't hurt anyone, sir," he said gently. "Are you feeling better now? Do you need anything?" The paramedics were amazed by Johnson's reaction. They had expected anger, accusations, or at least some demand for justice after what had appeared to be a life-threatening situation. Instead, they witnessed something extraordinary, pure compassion for someone who was clearly suffering from circumstances beyond his control. David's eyes filled with tears as he realized the full scope of what had happened. "I pointed a gun at you," he said, his voice shaking. "I threatened to shoot you. Why are you being so kind to me?" Johnson helped the paramedics adjust David's position on the stretcher to make him more comfortable. "Because you're sick and you needed help. That's what any decent person would do." As the ambulance drove away with David inside, Johnson finally had a moment to process what had just occurred. His fellow guards and supervisors gathered around him, checking to make sure he was okay and praising his incredible composure under pressure. But Johnson was already thinking about something else entirely. That evening, after his shift had ended and he had given his statement to the police, Johnson did something that surprised everyone who knew him. Instead of going home to rest after one of the most stressful days of his career, he went to the hospital to check on David. Johnson found David in a private room, looking small and vulnerable in his hospital bed. David was awake but clearly embarrassed and ashamed about what had happened. When he saw Johnson walk through the door, he immediately tried to apologize again. "Please don't apologize anymore," Johnson said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "You were having a medical emergency. That's not your fault." David explained his situation in more detail. He had been recently diagnosed with this rare form of epilepsy, and his doctors were still trying to find the right combination of medications to control his symptoms. The condition was unpredictable and could cause him to behave in ways that were completely unlike his normal personality. "I'm an elementary school teacher back home," David said sadly. "I love children and I would never hurt anyone. But when these episodes happen, I don't feel like myself. I get paranoid and scared, and I do things that don't make any sense." Johnson learned that David was traveling alone because his family was worried about his condition, but he had insisted that he could handle a vacation by himself. He had saved money for years to take this trip to London, and he didn't want his medical problems to prevent him from seeing the world. "Have you been able to contact your family?" Johnson asked. They're probably worried about you. David's face fell. I haven't called them yet. I don't know how to explain what happened. They're going to be so disappointed and scared. They were already nervous about me traveling alone. Without hesitation, Johnson offered to help David call his family and explain the situation. He spent the next hour helping David contact his parents and sister in Canada, reassuring them that their son and brother was safe and receiving good medical care. Johnson's presence made all the difference in those conversations. When David's family heard that the guard David had threatened was now sitting beside his hospital bed, offering support and friendship, they were moved to tears. This wasn't the story they had expected to hear. Over the next few days, Johnson visited David every day after his shifts. They talked about David's work as a teacher, Johnson's experiences as a guard, and their shared love of history and travel. What had started as a terrifying confrontation was becoming a genuine friendship between two men who had both shown remarkable character under extraordinary circumstances. Johnson helped David navigate the British healthcare system and made sure he was getting the best possible care. He also assisted with practical matters like contacting David's travel insurance company and rearranging his flight home to Canada. But most importantly, Johnson provided David with something he desperately needed: understanding and acceptance from someone who had every reason to be angry with him, but chose compassion instead. Word of Johnson's incredible response to the incident began to spread throughout the hospital, the palace, and eventually the wider community. Nurses and doctors were talking about the guard who visited his attacker every day with flowers and conversation. Police officers were sharing the story of the most professional and compassionate response to a threat they had ever witnessed. But Johnson wasn't thinking about recognition or praise. He was focused entirely on helping David recover and prepare for his journey home to Canada. Johnson had learned that David's family was struggling financially with his medical expenses, and the unexpected hospital stay in London was creating additional stress for everyone involved. During one of their daily conversations, David opened up about his fears for the future. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to travel again," he said sadly. "This condition is so unpredictable. I could have another episode anywhere, anytime. I might hurt someone next time or get myself into serious legal trouble." Johnson listened carefully, then shared his own perspective. "David, what happened between us wasn't about your illness making you a bad person. You were scared and confused, and you reached out for help the only way you could in that moment. The fact that you're so concerned about other people's safety shows exactly what kind of person you really are." These conversations were helping David process not just the incident at the palace, but his entire relationship with his medical condition. Johnson's acceptance and understanding were giving David hope that he could still live a full and meaningful life, despite his diagnosis. On David's last day in the hospital, Johnson arrived with a special gift. He had worked with the hospital staff and David's doctors in Canada to arrange for David to receive ongoing support from a support group for people with epilepsy in his hometown. Johnson had also researched travel programs specifically designed for people with medical conditions, so David wouldn't have to give up his dream of seeing the world. "You gave me something today that I'll never forget," David said as they prepared to say goodbye. "You showed me that even when I'm at my worst, I'm still worthy of kindness and respect. That's going to help me more than any medicine ever could." Johnson was deeply moved by David's words, but he had one more surprise. "Actually, David, I think you gave me something too. You reminded me why I do this job. It's not just about standing still and looking impressive. It's about serving people and protecting something important. Today, the most important thing I could protect was your dignity and your hope for the future." The story of their friendship had caught the attention of local news reporters, but both men had declined to give interviews. They felt that their experience was personal and meaningful to them, and they didn't want it turned into a media spectacle. However, their families and friends were so moved by what had happened that the story began to spread naturally through social media and word of mouth. David's flight back to Canada was scheduled for the next morning, but Johnson had arranged one final surprise. With special permission from his supervisors, Johnson was allowed to escort David to the airport in his dress uniform. It was an unprecedented gesture that showed the respect and friendship that had developed between them. At the airport, David's departure gate was filled with people who had heard about their story. Other travelers, airport staff, and even some of David's new friends from the hospital had come to wish him well. But the most emotional moment came when David turned to say goodbye to Johnson. "Thank you for seeing the real me," David said, embracing the man who had shown him such unexpected kindness. "Thank you for treating me like a human being when I couldn't even treat myself that way." Johnson's response was simple but profound. "Thank you for reminding me what it means to be human. Take care of yourself, my friend. And remember, you always have a friend in London." In the weeks following David's return to Canada, their friendship continued to grow through regular phone calls and messages. David's family was amazed by the positive change in his outlook and confidence. His doctors noticed improvements in his overall health that went beyond just managing his epilepsy. He seemed happier, more hopeful, and better able to cope with the challenges of his condition. Meanwhile, Johnson returned to his duties as a Queen's Guard, but something fundamental had changed in how he approached his work. He still maintained the same perfect discipline and professionalism, but now he understood on a deeper level that every person who came to see the Guards was carrying their own stories, struggles, and hopes. The story of Johnson's composure during the crisis and his compassion afterward began to attract international attention. News outlets around the world picked up the story, but they focused on the human elements rather than sensationalizing the dramatic confrontation. People were inspired by the example of how to respond to someone in crisis with understanding rather than judgment. David's school district in Canada heard about the story and invited him to speak to students and teachers about his experience with epilepsy and the importance of compassion in difficult situations. His presentations were so well received that he began speaking at medical conferences and support groups, helping other people with similar conditions. But the most significant development came 6 months after their first meeting. David called Johnson with exciting news. He and his family wanted to establish a foundation to support people with epilepsy who wanted to travel safely. They had been inspired by Johnson's kindness to create something positive that could help other people facing similar challenges. Johnson was honored when David asked him to serve on the foundation's board of directors. Together, they created programs that provided medical support, travel planning assistance, and emergency response training for people with epilepsy and their families. The foundation also funded research into better treatments and worked to reduce the stigma surrounding seizure disorders. The Royal Guard Epilepsy Foundation, as it came to be known, grew rapidly with support from around the world. People were drawn to the story of how a moment of crisis had been transformed into lasting hope and help for others. Within 2 years, the foundation had helped hundreds of people travel safely and pursue their dreams despite their medical conditions. Johnson's superiors at the palace were so impressed by his character and the positive attention he had brought to the Queen's Guard that they promoted him to a training position. He began teaching new guards not just about military discipline and protocol, but about the deeper meaning of service, protecting and caring for all people, regardless of their circumstances. Every year on the anniversary of their first meeting, David returned to London to visit Johnson and to attend the foundation's annual fundraising event. The venue was always the same, a hotel near Buckingham Palace, where their unlikely friendship had begun in such dramatic circumstances. At the third anniversary event, David stood before a crowd of donors, medical professionals, and supporters to tell their story once again. But this time he had a special announcement. The foundation had grown so successful that it was expanding internationally, with chapters opening in 12 countries. None of this would exist without one man's choice to respond to fear and confusion with kindness and understanding, David said, looking directly at Johnson in the audience. He showed me that even in our darkest moments, we are capable of bringing out the best in each other. Johnson had never expected that his simple act of human decency would create such far-reaching positive change in the world. But as he looked around the room at all the people whose lives had been improved by the foundation's work, he realized that this was what true service really meant. The story that had begun with a moment of terror and confusion had become a lasting testament to the power of compassion, forgiveness, and the belief that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Johnson and David had shown the world that even the most frightening situations could be transformed into opportunities for human connection and positive change. And every day, as Johnson stood at his post outside Buckingham Palace, He carried with him the knowledge that behind every face in the crowd was a person with their own story worth understanding and protecting.